Hi.
This is who we are, then I'm going to assume this is what God intended. So let's start with a prayer. This is a prayer of St. Anselm. O Lord my God, teach my heart this day where and how to find you. You have made me and remade me, and you have bestowed on me all the good things I possess, and still I do not know you. I have not yet done that for which I was made. Teach me to seek you, for I cannot seek you unless you teach me, or find you unless you show yourself to me. Let me seek you in my desire. Let me desire you in my seeking. Let me find you by loving you. Let me love you when I find you. Amen. So I think the title of the forum was originally Finding Spiritual Practices that Help Us with Life Balance. And like so often happens, the forum that I'm thinking of and the forum that I actually put together are a little different. And what I really thought about as I was starting working with the material is that I think what we really need to think about, or I need to think about anyway, are what are those barriers we have to authentic spirituality, the barriers that we have to our relationship with God. Because if we think about those, they are going to help us with life balance, and they're going to help us discover practices that make sense. So the health and vibrancy of our spiritual life, or spirituality, go hand in hand with the health and vibrancy of our spiritual practices. Spiritual practices, quite simply, are disciplines that help us to consciously develop our spiritual dimension. So they are very concrete. And while they're not an end in and of themselves, they do provide us with those pathways to grace. The health and vibrancy of our spiritual life or spirituality goes hand in hand with the vibrancy of our spiritual practices, which then goes hand in hand with our intentionality. And this may be one of the great barriers to our spirituality and our spiritual practice. I think so often we get stuck spiritually because we are not specific, concrete, or intentional enough in our practices. Some people rebel against the notion of having, being disciplined in our relationship with God. They want this free-floating relationship with God. But think about it. What relationship would last? Any relationship, if we didn't have some degree of discipline, intentionality, and concreteness. I think part of the reason my husband and I can banter for hours and hours, usually inanely about nothing in particular, is that we really do take time to be with each other. So it allows a certain comfort with each other. And it's no different than with God. So when was the last time any of you went on a play date with God? I know, it's like the eyes go, what? What could that be? But wouldn't that be great? Like if you and God went to Legoland. I mean, I don't know, whatever a play date with God might be to you. But think about, a relationship just won't last if you don't make intention to spend time together. And it's going to be exactly the same in our relationship with God. So another factor which contributes to our being stuck, and this may be one of the big ones, and that's perfectionism. Following rules become more important than the reason we're doing what we're doing. Or if I don't have 30 minutes to pray every day, I'm not going to. That somehow, if I can't do what I'm supposed to do, then, I just won't do it. So what do you see as other barriers? Perfectionism, one. What might be some others that come to mind for you? Busyness, sure. Yeah. Busyness, perfectionism. What are some others?
Not putting it first, like on your to-do list.
Right. Consciously saying, I'm going to do this, rather than just, the day went by and I didn't do it. Yeah.
I think it helps if you have a particular time every day.
Yeah. and that's what a lot of people have to do, is that they set a particular time. Maybe they'll do gratitude, or thank God I woke up. I often do that. And then at the end of the day, thank God I had a good day, or these are the good things that happened today. So those are some practices that can happen as we wake up and go to sleep. Any others that come to mind? We're talking about what might be barriers to just spiritual practices, to engaging in spiritual practices.
Well, it's easy to skip. It's like exercise.
Yeah.
I mean, you just don't quite get to it sometimes.
Right.
And, it happens.
It does happen all the time. Here are some others, because and some of these are the same, but these are some of the ones that I thought of. As I said, perfectionism is a big one. And I'm going to tell you at the end of this what I think is the great counterweight to perfectionism. A second one is fear, believe it or not, and we can talk about fear of what? Expectations, lack of vision, denial, and self-centeredness. I know that sounds terrible. Under or overestimating ourselves, an outdated concept of God or Jesus, inadequate knowledge of resources of different types of spiritual practices. So those are just a few to sort of get the wheels spinning. And I can't deal with all three, but I'm going to deal with the three that I see the most. I'm also, in addition to a priest, a certified spiritual director. And so this is a big part of what I do with people, is help them walk their spiritual path. And so these are the ones that I run into the most. It's the perfectionism, fear, and an outdated concept of God and in Jesus. God in general, Jesus in particular. So perfectionism. This is one, and by the way, if you have any questions or comments, feel free. We're a small enough group. Fear is one of the great spirit killers of perfectionism, and one of the primary ways we sabotage our relationship with God. While we know we should do a certain thing, we know we should, that's also a great spirit killer, is the great should. Engage in something, we can get into the dreaded yes but syndrome. Yes, I should pray, but I don't have time. Yes, I should meditate, but I can't keep still. Yes, I should go to church, but all these people are coming for dinner. There's always a ton of the yes buts that go on in our lives. Another thing that happens, though, is perfectionism can lead to poor self-esteem. I didn't do it. I wasn't perfect in my practice, and so and then we start feeling bad about ourselves, and then we just give up. Right? Yes. And it also perfectionism can also cause us to judge others. Shocking, I know. But, especially within the Episcopal Church, we can look around and say, why don't these people know when to kneel and stand and sit? It says in the bulletin. Or, why do I know how to kneel, stand, and sit at the right time? So, we really do sort of sabotage ourselves with this perfectionism. In Buddhism, there's a concept called the two arrows. And that is, the first arrow is, I didn't do something right. I didn't pray today. I didn't do whatever today. The second arrow is, and that makes me a bad person. And this is what perfectionism so often leads to, is this sense of, if I didn't do it, then I am bad. Or I am not holy enough. I am not X enough. Or I'm too much of something that's not good. Type A's. How many type A's in this room? There's a few. Okay. Some aren't willing to out themselves. I get it. They have a tendency to do this, and I'd like to say give it a rest, but that's like saying don't feel bad about yourself when you're going to feel bad about yourself. But here's a concept: allow God to be the perfect one. You don't have to be. Let God just take over that role and don't worry about it. So, Anybody willing to share how perfectionism might have gotten in your way? Engaged in, spiritual practice or in prayer or in your relationship with God?
I guess I don't understand what you mean by being a perfectionist and praying to God.
Yeah.
I don't understand that part. I mean, you just,
Good. That means you probably don't feel that way.
no, I mean, you just say what you feel or you read a prayer.
Yeah. Some people, they have an idea that in order to pray, you have to do it. Prayer. We're just talking about prayer, for instance. You have to do it in a certain way. You have to do it for a certain amount of time. You have to do it at a certain time of day. I mean, they've got very clear rights and wrongs
Oh.
about how to engage in any particular spiritual practice. And most of us can't maintain that kind of perfectionism for any amount of time. So eventually, we're going to be less than perfect. And then that becomes, as I said, the second arrow. Then I'm a bad Christian.
And they think they're bad.
Yeah.
I was thinking that it's related to this, but I thought when I was older I would have all this time. And it's just as busy and just as many responsibilities, they're just different.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh, I would have all this time to be this holy person, I was working. And I just think that there has to be a constancy somehow through every stage of life. But I find like the stages aren't that clear, and so it's a lot to stay on track, and also people around you aren't on track, so sometimes that's it's just harder to be the different person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll touch on this in a shortly, but you're right. At different points of our lives, what makes sense won't make sense later. And we think that once I'm done with school, once I'm retired, once I no longer have kids in the house, once whatever, that somehow I'm going to have all this time, and miraculously you don't. Because for most of us who, for a lot of us, just other things come into our lives. New responsibilities, new things to do, and then we fall short. We fall short of what we think we should be doing. Not necessarily, but Others, any thoughts about perfectionism? Has it gotten in the way or not? Well, let's talk about fear. Fear and perfectionism often go together. We try to be perfect so people won't see our flaws. And I think that's just general in life, not just in terms of our spirituality. But this, of course, begs the question, what are we afraid of? And there's a fair amount of fear in our culture already. Economic fear, fear of losing jobs, homes, health insurance, retirement, fear of violence, fear of the other, fear that things won't get better. Clearly there's fear about the state of this country regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on. Everybody seems worried. So what does this have to do with spirituality? I think a big part of it is there's a fear that God may not be out there. Or if God is, God doesn't care. Or God doesn't care about me. And this is a tough one. It can be rather painful for people. We can have a fear of God, and this relates to what I'm saying is probably an outdated vision of God, that for some God is frightening, capable of putting us in hell, and wouldn't hesitate a nanosecond to do so if we fall out of line. I expect to see all of you there. But also fear of getting our hearts broken. If we trust in God, and God somehow doesn't come through. We tend to be very specific about what we want from God, how we want God to respond to us, how we want God to respond to our prayer requests. And if things don't happen that way, we lose heart. Does that resonate with anybody? It's like an example I often think about is at a certain point in my life, I knew 2 women with breast cancer. And both of them prayed for healing. And one of them died, and one of them didn't. And I would say in some respects, it's the woman who died who was healed. She didn't live. I mean, she died. She succumbed to the disease. But the peace that she had in the process of praying through her dying was so amazing, and it was so healing for those of us who had the privilege to walk the journey with her. Whereas the other woman, she did, she survived the breast cancer, and she's much better now, but she really walked that journey in a lot of fear. And so it's just interesting. We really, I think, need to think about what it is we mean when we say, let God be God, God, your will be done. Are we really willing to surrender to that reality? And so that's where fear comes in. Or, we get our hearts broken, and we just don't want to go there again. If you prayed to God for something and it didn't work out in a certain way, and so you doubt if God cares for you, maybe you even doubt the presence of God, the reality of God. It's better to acknowledge that rather than to pretend it's not so, but this is something that can be really, really hard for us. The next one is an outdated vision of God and or Jesus, a murky view of Jesus. For those of us who grew up going to church, and how many of us grew up going to church? Okay. Many of us in this room. I don't know about you. My dad worked for IBM, so we moved every 2 years, and every church we went to had the same picture of Jesus. He was this pale man on this hill. And I've been to Jerusalem. I've never seen any land that looked like that. But anyway, so there was this pale man in this absolutely pure white robe with all these children, sitting around him, and he's looking all beatific. And so that's the vision of Jesus we have as children, right? Of course, Jesus probably wasn't a pale man. He probably wasn't clean all the time. And he probably didn't have children around him at all times. And he probably hung out with people who were as grimy as he was. But while we grow up, our vision of Jesus doesn't. He's still that pale man on the hill surrounded by children. And that's lovely, but it's inadequate for our adulthood. That's not necessarily the Jesus that we will be carrying with us into adulthood. That's going to be able to be the Jesus who walks our life together. So, furthermore, every generation and culture tends to remake its vision of Jesus. The era that produced the movie Ben-Hur is very different from the era that produced Jesus Christ Superstar, which is very different from the culture that produced The Passion of the Christ, and now the TV show God Friended Me. So we tend to remake Jesus in the context of our culture. So you can see how it can get confusing. We've got the Jesus we grew up with, we've got the Jesus of current society, we've got the Jesus of media, and we're not sure who or what we're praying to, or who or what we profess as Lord and Savior. It's confusing. So as we grow up, we pile up all these different images, and it's this sort of weird conglomeration. And the other thing is we tend to make Jesus in our own image. We make the Jesus that we want to be. I remember being in a Bible study once where there was an African American woman, and her vision of Jesus is of a man of color. And there was another man, white man, who said, no, Jesus wasn't African. Jesus was an African. Jesus wasn't. And so they got into this whole big fight, which was very unseemly. But it really goes to heart about how we really see Jesus in a certain way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Anybody aware of that or seeing that, like how Jesus has been changed for you or not changed for you as you've gotten older? Yeah.
I think there was a lot of emphasis on miracles that made Jesus less human.
Yes.
It was overly done on the divine side. So
I'm
it
sorry.
was difficult to be like Jesus because you couldn't heal people or turn water into wine.
Or walk on water.
Yeah, exactly. It's so literal, but it's also overly miraculous. And so I found I had to come down from that, from my childhood vision. Of
That is so
Jesus,
true. So
to
true.
a more real person that
Yeah.
was learning along the way.
It's hard to identify with the miracle worker
Yeah.
in the same way that maybe to deal with or to identify with Jesus, the very real human being as well. Others.
I think as society becomes more diverse, so does Jesus in our minds.
Yes.
As we watch, and society looks different now. And I think that Jesus needs to as well. What we see, he's almost like, think of Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's kind of like Jesus is like that. He's like all colors and all things to all people. And he should be for us too. And accepting of the fact that he is that.
Yeah, so did everybody hear that? That Jesus is a reflection of all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And as we become more diverse, we've probably always been this diverse, but now because of media, we can see diversity in places where we hadn't before, that to see Jesus reflected in all these ways. Yeah.
Like when The Shack came out, that kind of brought all that to light too, the book.
How so?
Having God as the black woman and the spirit as I think she's Asian, and
Yeah.
just the unexpected.
Yeah. There's an old movie, and I can't remember the title of it, 40s or 50s, I think, and Jesus or God was the Mexican, housekeeper up in heaven.
Oh,
And so people kept on,
The Milagro Beanfield War.
well, but that too, but no, this is a different movie. That's older than that one. But it's sort of like Jesus up in heaven, sweeping, the floors in heaven, and people walk by and say, hi, hi, Jose, or it turns out that he's Jesus. Or there's this great Facebook video where there's this man praying in church. He says, oh, Jesus, I just need you with me so much. And all of a sudden, this African-American man in dreadlocks appears before him, and he says, yes, my son. And the guy says, I'm asking for Jesus. And the guy's going, I am Jesus. But did most of you grow up with the photo of Jesus, or the painting of Jesus, or the print of Jesus, on the hill with all the kids?
The Sacred Heart.
And that one too. Yeah. It's hard to give those up because they were beautiful images. They just don't work for us anymore. Or they don't work for us as adults. I think they work fine for kids. So, what can we do about this? It's not just these are some of the barriers, but what can we do about it? The first thing I think we need to do is to name what holds us back. Don't be afraid of it. Really, I think I said in the beginning that I think one of the best ways to overcome perfectionism, if we have it, but really might be true for any spiritual practice, is to be curious. Just be curious. If something's not going well, how come? Don't judge. Just look at it. If something's going really well, how come? Once again, don't judge, because chances are it's not going to last indefinitely. So I think the first thing we need to do is to get real. Be real. Be real about our spiritual practices, but also to be real about what we could do at any given point in our lives. There's a quote from a woman named Dorothy Bass from her book, Practicing Our Faith. Characteristics of spiritual practices that help us break through are those that, quote, address fundamental human needs and conditions through concrete human acts. Fundamental human needs and conditions through concrete human acts. So our practices are the human place where people cooperate with God in doing what needs to be done. That sounds pretty simple, right? Sounds that way. Practices are practical. I think a lot of times for those of us who tend towards contemplative practice or mysticism, people tend to see us up there in the clouds or floating around, and the only way any of us can stay in a mystical place is to engage in very concrete acts, is to get off the cloud. And I think that's a good one for all of us. We just have to do it. Someone in need of hospitality doesn't need to read a book on hospitality. You know what I'm saying? A lot of times it's like, well, I'll do this, but I better read everything there is to know about whatever this is, and then I'll do it. Well, sometimes we just need to jump in and do it. In the process, we can read some of these books or talk to people or do these various things. Spiritual practices need to make sense to us. So when I was in seminary, and I think I've told this story to some of you, I'm going to tell it again, that at that point I was doing centering prayer in the morning. So I'd wake up, have about 20 minutes of prayer, and then I'd get on with my day, and that was lovely. This was when I was in New York, and I was, planning on coming back to San Diego. I went to seminary in New York, and getting onto my last semester in school, I remember this clearly is like standing here right now. I was in my room, and I started to pray, and there's a discipline that says when you're doing centering prayer or meditation or anything, that if a thought pops into your mind, to imagine a river and to put that thought on a boat and let the boat float down the river. And actually, it works. It does work, but not always. So I'm praying, and then I'm thinking, I need to buy boxes. Okay, so there's the river. I put the I need to buy boxes on the boat. Let it go. I need masking tape. So, and then the masking tape canoe went down. And so it went until eventually I had this vision of all these boats ramming into each other, about ready to go off a waterfall. That's when I determined maybe this isn't the best spiritual practice for me at this point in my life, right? It just wasn't working as much as I liked it. And so what I did then is I did morning prayer. There was something about morning prayer, I open the book, I read the words, I don't have to think independently too much, but at least I'm engaged in some practice, and that was very, very good for me. It kept me somewhat connected. So there are three basic questions any of us can ask when we think about what spiritual practice may be best for us at this point in time. The first one is, what am I deeply attracted to and why? What is, I just do it and I feel right. Right now I'm finding, much to my surprise, I live in Point Loma, and so it's a bit of a drive up here, and often I will just have it be the car silent. Like when I drove up here today, especially on Sundays, I keep the radio off, I don't listen to a book, I don't listen to music. It's just quiet, and that is, for me, glorious. I'll probably do the same thing when I leave today, because it gives me that space between leaving here with a lot of people and then getting home with my husband, who when I get home, I can tell you every TV in the house will be on, all on a different station. Because he's just that way. But that is something that I'm attracted to. And it might be listening to music. It might be reading a certain author. But it's just like, be aware of what you're attracted to and don't fight it. Sometimes we think we should do something other than what we're attracted to. And I think When God touches our heart, and we feel this yearning to engage in something, that's something, once again, to be curious about, to think about. It's a gift. That attraction is a gift. The second question is, where do I feel God is calling me to stretch and grow? Are there things that I don't want to look at? Are there things that I spend too much time at the expense of others? If something bothers me, and it doesn't have to be in church or spirituality, but if something really bothers me, somebody says something that bothers me, that's once again something to be curious about. What is it that's bothering me so? What is that saying? Maybe that's telling me something that I need to look at in my relationship with God. Is to, rather than look at being annoyed as being just annoying, is to look at annoyance as a gift. Because chances are that if it really annoys us, God is telling us something in those moments. And with everything so polarized nowadays, politically and socially and all these things, there's a lot of room for spiritual growth, right? Because we're all annoyed. And so let's use that rather than a way to stay annoyed is trying to figure out what God is telling us in this moment. And the third question is, where is it that I need balance in my life? What parts of my life am I neglecting, and others that I'm spending too much time with? Maybe I'm not going to the gym enough. I know I'm not going to the gym enough. What is it that's going on that is just sort of out of whack? You know how we all feel out of balance, out of whack, that there's something that's not quite right. And so that we ask ourselves these three questions: what am I deeply attracted to and why? Where do I feel God is calling me to stretch and grow? What kind of balance do I need in my life? And then we consider, what is realistic to commit to? I think we really need to honor our personal limitations as to what we can do. We may be parents, we may be caregivers, we may have a very grueling work schedule. Only a number of things, but I mean, if you only have, and this is one of the big things I do in spiritual direction, is people think, well, I should have X, once again, perfectionism, X number of minutes to pray, and I said, if you've got 3 minutes, do 3 minutes, and that's fine. That's 3 minutes you might not have done otherwise. Don't worry about the 30, the 20, the hour, this or that. Take the time that you have. Be realistic about what's going on in your life, the personal circumstances. I think this is one of the biggest things, as I think I said earlier, is that people have unrealistic expectations of themselves, of what they can really do. And that's going to kill you. It's going to kill you in a whole lot of ways. So we need to be mindful of that. The other thing to do is to map out a perfect day. What would a perfect day look like for you? What makes you excited about getting up in the morning? What's his name? There's a TED Talk. I can't remember the name. And this is a little PG rated, but we're all adults. So he mapped out his perfect day. He wakes up, has breakfast, makes love with his wife, goes to work, comes back at lunch, makes love with his wife, and it sort of goes on and on. And he says, I've never had that day, but he said, that would be the perfect day. But to think about, what would this perfect day for you look like? Would it be to wake up, have breakfast, pray, go for a walk, go to the gym, read, go to work? I mean, think about what that day might entail. And I think that helps guide us, is that as we get up thinking, what am I excited about? What does my perfect day look like today? And sometimes our perfect day will change every day. I suggest that if you agree to do this to yourself, and it's up to you, is to keep a journal for 7 days. Just 7 days. keep a journal regarding your spiritual practices. And it could be nothing. You know, the next day, you know, I want to get away from the 2 arrows. We'll just start with the 1 arrow. I didn't do it. Okay. How come? But I think if you were to do it for a period of time, such as 7 days or any period of time, you start getting a sense of what's going to work for you and what isn't at this period of time. As I said, are adjustments necessary? And I ask that you be discerning rather than judgmental. Just see what God is saying in what emerges in, whether or not you keep a journal or not. Marjorie Thompson, a woman from a great book called Soul Feast, An Invitation to the Christian Spiritual Life, writes, God is the one who calls us into relationship, and God does everything possible to restore us when we have wriggled out of this mutual relationship. God's love lies at the root of our hunger for God. Love is God's hunger for relationship with us. And so, God is starving to be in relationship with us. Starving. And anything that we can do helps quench that thirst, but God will never quit starving for us. Thank you.